Hello and welcome to this tutorial where I will demonstrate some fairly simple techniques to take an out-of-camera image and get it ready for sharing with family and friends. This tutorial will focus on Photoshop, Camera Raw, and the use of layers and masks to enhance certain parts of an image while leaving other parts of the image untouched. The tips I'm going to share with you can be used to enhance any image, so even though I may be demonstrating this technique on a flower or landscape, the thought process and the use of layers and filters can be applied to all subject matter. This particular image is an image of a Columbine taken against blue phlox in the Smoky Mountains in Tennessee. This image was captured with a macro lens that was set to f4. I chose f4 because I wanted the body of the Columbine to stay fairly in focus, while the background phlox would be nice and blurry. I'm going to show you a couple of ways to enhance this blur, so just in case you did not take an image set the same way that I did, you can still create the same effect in post-processing. So let's get started. So we're going to start off, at least I do, by cropping. I don't want to really start processing this image and creating effects and working on something that isn't sort of in my final view. I don't always start this way, but in this particular image I'm going to, and one of the reasons can be seen right down here at the bottom of the image where my cursor's lit up, that these two particular phlox flowers are fairly sharp and forward, just there at the same sort of depth as the Columbine. So for me, they're a distraction, and I know I'm not going to leave it this way, so I'm going to start off right away by removing them. And so I'm going to do that by cropping. So up here on the top right, you'll see the crop tool, and I'm just going to drag up to get that out. And in terms of the rest of the image, I'm actually okay. Maybe I'll bring it just a little bit in. I can sort of take care of this upper area that was a different color by removing it that way as well, although I'm trying not to get the phlox in the center. So what I'll do is I'll leave this here, and then I'll show you a trick for getting rid of it by cloning. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit the enter key, and I'm going to accept my crop. Now, you can see that I didn't crop out this bud over here, and there's a particular reason. I actually like these three little leaves that are starting here. So I'm going to find a different way to get rid of this, and I'm going to actually do that at the same time as I get rid of this big open spot that I actually didn't see when I was shooting it. So our first step is done, which is cropping, and now I'm going to duplicate the layer. So you can duplicate layers by either hitting Control or Command J, which will do a duplicate, or by going to Layer and then choosing Duplicate Layer, or by right-clicking and choosing Duplicate Layer here in the menu. I do it a bunch of different ways. It just depends on sort of where my hands are at the time. So now that we've created a background layer, we can always go back to this original layer just in case we need to, but it's just good behavior to do that if you're doing single image processing, because now you always have one to go back to. So on the background layer, I'm going to start off by going into Camera Raw, and one of the cool things about Photoshop Creative Cloud is that they've created a filter for Camera Raw. And it's the same as going directly into Camera Raw when you open an image, or working in Lightroom if you happen to have Lightroom. That's also a version of Camera Raw. But this is a nice way to be able to go back to Camera Raw at any time when processing. And I use it for a lot of things. So if I was doing a landscape or a sunset, the last thing I'll actually do is go back to the Camera Raw filter and check my highlights to make sure at the end of the process I haven't created any blown highlights that I didn't realize were there. So this is a great trick to know, is that Camera Raw can be accessed throughout the processing. So we're going to go ahead and open it, and here we go. Here's our image. So a couple things. I actually don't do a ton in Camera Raw. Let me get that all on the screen for you. But I do some things, and I do some of them globally, and I'll do some things in the with the brush tool. Just depends on my mood and what I want for the image. So it's one of those things where you start to have to learn what the filters are and what they do, and then make decisions about how to go about using them. So right now, when you first open Camera Raw, you are in the sort of global adjustment pane, and you get your white balance, your temperature, and your tint, and your exposure, contrast, highlights, shadows, whites, blacks, clarity, vibrance, and saturation. And I'll tell you, the kind of coolest slider in here is the clarity slider, which I'm going to show you in a minute. So this is, as I mentioned, this is the general sort of block and tackle. This affects everything that you see in the image is going to be impacted by any of the slider changes you make. So for example, if I bring the exposure down, it's darkening everything, not just a particular area of the image that maybe I want to darken. So that's just something to keep in mind, that when you open up Camera Raw, you will automatically end up in the sort of global changes. If you are interested in using Camera Raw for more subtle changes, you can actually choose the brush tool, which is right here at the top left. If we click that, you'll see that it looks suspiciously familiar. The only difference is that we've now added sharpness, noise reduction, moire reduction, defringe, as well as brush sizes. And when you first get into this brush, you'll see that there's a new brush is selected. As soon as you start painting with that brush, then anytime you go to another section, it'll say add. If you realize that you've brushed something too much, you've added masking someplace you didn't want it, you can actually choose erase. And then if you want, you can add as many brushes as you want. So that's kind of a neat trick. The one other thing I always do is I leave it so that this is checked as auto mask, which means it's going to look for edges. I find that to be actually really helpful when you're brushing, and it'll actually reduce the amount of stuff you might need to erase. The other thing is in the brushing, when I'm brushing, to create the mask in the first place, I like to say show mask. And so an example of this is if I wanted to just mask our little guy here, you can see that the red mask, it's hard to tell because I'm actually using a red mask, but you'll see that the red mask is painting over. Now you can see that I've gone over here where it's turned green. So this is an opportunity where I would either select erase, which is up here in the corner, or I can hold down the Alt or Option key and this will turn into an erase function. And you'll see in the top right that it says erase up on the menu, even though I didn't actually select it. So you can actually then erase and clean up around. It's taking, my computer's being slow, but you can see that it's erasing the mask from the areas that I don't want affected by any changes that I might make. So once I've painted the mask in and I know that I've selected the areas that I want, I actually turn off the show mask so I can get back to the original image. Now you can see that this thing turned purple. The reason it turned purple is because all of these adjustments are sticky, and I completely forgot about it, but it's always good to go back and reset them. And you can either do that by double clicking the little triangles. So you see that it goes back to 0. So my exposure is coming back up. Double click on contrast, it goes to 0, so on and so forth. Or if you know that you want to add, say, clarity, you might, and in this case I don't necessarily want to add 60, but you can hold down the Alt key and hit any one of the plus or minuses. Everything else has reset itself to 0, and it's Alt or Option, but clarity moved down to where I happen to think I wanted to go, but it's a good starting point. So there's a couple ways to clear these. Now I'm not actually going to make any adjustments in here for brush adjustments. I just wanted to show you that it existed. So let's go back to global, and as you can see, like this mask, when I hover on this dot, highlights where the mask is again, which is kind of a cool feature. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the mask and then hit delete so it goes away. So we've got our original Columbine back. And to get back to the global adjustments, you come back up and you can either hit the zoom tool, which is over here in the top left of the screen, or you can hit the hand tool. But if you hit zoom, you come back, and as you can see now, we're back in the global adjustments. So one of the first things I'm going to do is add clarity. For me, it's the go-to slider always. I love the effect of it. I like to see what it does before I add contrast, and then I might decide, okay, well, let's see what contrast adds to it. It adds a little bit of depth, so that's good. In this particular case, I can look at my histogram up here in the top corner, or at the top of the adjustments, and I can actually see that right here on whites, I actually don't have any data. It's not because it says 0, by the way. It's just that you can see that there's no data along this continuum. So I have got a lot of data over here in the dark, got some data here in the midtones, but as I move to the right, I've got data in the highlights, but as I get all the way over here, that's just a little black line, which means there are no whites. So for me, what that does is say I need to actually come down to the white slider and add. And if you watch the histogram, without even looking at the image itself, just watch the histogram, you'll see that the data moves to the right until it gets to the edge. Now, That definitely improves the image. We'll go back to 0. It kind of tones it back down, kind of mutes it out. If I drag it back up till I get to the edge, you can see that around 38, I've added some pop to this. And all I've really had to do is watch the histogram to do that. Now, if I were to go further with the whites, you'll see that I start to blow out some areas here. So here on the Columbine, I've blown out the yellow. Here down in the bottom, I've blown out these 2 flocks. That's what I'm talking about by using camera raw to check for blown highlights. If I wanted to say I liked the white that I've added, even though I've added maybe more than I needed, I could tone these highlights down by using the highlight slider, which is right here in the middle of the menu. And all you do is drag that to the left until those disappear. And you can keep going until as far as you want. Now in this case, because I've brought those whites up so much, I'm not able to recover all the highlight in this one adjustment, but there's a few tricks for that as well. So instead of having my whites up quite that high, I'm going to go ahead and bring them back around 38. 38 got me some pop without any blown highlights, so I don't even need to worry about that adjustment. So I might just start with this. There's things I want to do here. I don't want to really enhance the background much further than it is, but I also have things that I want to remove. So we're going to go back to Photoshop to do that, and to get back, we just go ahead and hit OK. And you'll see that it's come in. And the way to tell that your changes have been made is all I have to do is turn on and off the little eye here. And if I toggle that, this is without showing what's on this background copy, and this is showing what I've done so far just with camera raw. And I think it's already appreciably better looking. Even though there's things I want to continue to do to it, it's already a better image just simply for having played with a couple of sliders. So the next step is to correct a few things here that we don't like. So we are not big fans of the little sort of this yellow leaf. It's probably another bud actually now that I'm looking at it. There's this bud over here on the right. Not a big fan of that. And then there's this big gaping black hole, which I'm also not a big fan of. So there's a couple ways that you can approach this. You could clone using the cloning tool, which is right here on the menu bar. You could use the patch tool, which I've just selected by right clicking here. It's the spot healing tool, patch is below it, so you could use that. Although I still don't necessarily think that in this image, particularly when there's a blur in the background, that works very well. It ends up looking very muddy and the edges seem to be pretty evident. So I'm going to show you another trick for this, which we're going to be able to use layers and masks to reveal what we want. So first things first, we need to actually duplicate our background copy that we already had. And what I'll do is I'll go ahead and change this just to say camera raw so I know the layer difference. And I'm going to go ahead and right click again and choose duplicate layer up here at the top. So camera raw copy, and we're going to say fixes, just so we know what layer it is. Now, the neat thing about this is when you first create a layer, it's the layer that's being seen. So in this case, we haven't done anything, so it looks exactly like the layer below it. But I'm going to go ahead and actually create a mask. Now, a white mask reveals. So again, this white mask is revealing everything that's happening right here in this part of the thumbnail. And in this case, we still have yet to do anything to this. So it's showing everything. If we take this mask and make it black, we are actually hiding it, and we're going to reveal what's below it. So in this case, we're going to hit Command or Control I, and that'll change your mask to black. The other way to create a black mask right off the get-go is to hold down the Alt or Option key when selecting your mask tool, which is this guy right here at the bottom of the screen. If you hold down Alt and click that, the mask will come up black. Now the reason that I have gone ahead and select black is because I'm actually going to do something down here with the camera raw file, or layer, excuse me, and I'm only going to reveal parts of it. So first thing we're going to do is toggle off the layer of fixes. So now we're looking at the camera raw layer. Again, you didn't see any changes in the image because we haven't done anything yet, but you're about to see those change. With the camera raw layer selected, we're going to go ahead and choose transform. So if you choose edit and transform, free transform, excuse me, which is Command or Control T, now we get bounding box around the image. The bounding box allows us to actually pick this image up and move it. So I'm going to go ahead and hold down the left mouse key. I'm just going to drag this up a bit. And I can sort of move it around to see where I'm going with it. But as you can see, I'm like, well, you know, here's some flowers that are going to fit nicely over our big black patch. As you can tell, it's also sort of covered up the issue that we're going to have up here in the corner, as well as the issue that we had in the top left, just depending on how I aim it. So I'm going to go ahead and hit enter, or you can hit the check mark at the top of the screen. Either way, that commits the change. Now, at a glance, we've basically destroyed the image, but we're about to fix that. So now we go back, choose the fixes layer, and toggle it back on. Okay, so I'm looking at this and it caught my attention. I was like, wait a minute, why does it not look right? And the reason it doesn't look right is because I actually hid the layer that I wanted to show, which is the fixes layer. So we're going to go back and make this white again. And you'll see that if we go back to our original view. So again, all I did is the command or control, hold down that and hit I, and it went back to white. Now we're back at our original image, and this is where we're going to use the kind of magic of layers and masks to make some corrections to the image. What we're first going to do is grab our brush tool. So our brush tool is up here in the top right, but you can also just hit the B and it will select that automatically for you. I want to make sure that I have a fairly soft brush, so if I come up over to this side of the options, I can see that my hardness is a little bit too hard. I don't necessarily want to have hard edges in this brush. The size is also fairly small, so I can either drag my size up by using this slider, or my favorite go-to is the left and right brackets, which are right next to the P key on your keyboard. The left bracket, which is immediately to the right of the P, makes the brush smaller. The next bracket over, your right bracket, actually makes it bigger if you just tap on that. So this is how I like to size, because I can just work two-handed and it moves pretty quickly. When we want to hide something, we actually paint in black. So you can see right now that the color picker is, the foreground is set to white, so we're going to need to shift that. The easiest way to shift it is with this little toggle key here. You just tap that and it goes back and forth. Now, the reason that we're going to use black is because we moved the camera raw layer up so we could hide some stuff in the fixes layer, and right now we're revealing everything in the fixes layer. So our solution to that will be to reveal things from below it, and the only way that we can do that is by kind of painting out in black here. So I'm going to check my opacity, which is up here at the very top. This is the brush opacity, not the layer opacity, and I'm going to bring that all the way up because I'm actually covering, and it'll be a little bit easier to get covered faster if that's at 100%. So now we're going to start over here on the bud that's kind of hanging in our view. We're just going to paint this out. There you go. Something pretty easy like that. Now we're going to go over to our little bud over here in the top corner, and we're going to paint this out. Okay. And then lastly, we're going to fill this big hole here. And hopefully we'll get purple flowers as well as green leaves. Kind of get rid of that little spot there that I'm not really a big fan of. And all I'm doing is painting. I'm kind of going about it in my own little way, but you can kind of move it around any way that you want. And because I don't want this to look exactly like the section below it, I'm just going to paint down here a little bit where it doesn't look exactly like the same flowers, even though we know that it is. In this little black spot, we can kind of fill in with some green leaves. And all we need to be careful of is that we don't paint over our Columbine, which is our focus. We don't paint over our little bud here, that is also our focus. And then we don't accidentally throw in one little patch of purple where there is otherwise no purple. So in this case, you can see I started building that out. I can either fully add in more purple flowers, which is fine, but it does kind of look like this stuff at the bottom, or by changing to a white brush, I can now paint this out. So that's something good to know, that you might find that you've painted something in that you didn't really need and only causes a distraction. So the way to fix that is to go back to white. So we can toggle here to go back to white. If you want, you can also hit the X key. The X key will take you back and forth between black and white, and just paint it back out. So Now remember, you might know what this looked like, but nobody else looking at this image has clarity about what it was before. So nobody knows there's a big hole there, and so there's no expectation or sort of hurt feelings that you've gone about fixing something that is more appealing to you. So realize that you sort of know you're doing this when you're processing, but in really many respects, it's an illusion. The whole thing is an illusion, and so you should make this image what you want it to be, and everybody's going to appreciate that for your vision, even though it might not be 100% what was seen. Now, this is true of all types of photography except for journalistic photography, where you're not supposed to make changes, so that's just sort of a sideline. But you should feel the freedom to enhance and improve your images so that they're pleasing to you. Okay, so enough about that, but here we are. We filled our, got rid of our little bud up at the top. We've gotten rid of our bud here at the right. We filled our big hole. We've managed to create a situation where our Columbine is still only surrounded by green, and we're ready to go to the next step. So in this next step, I'm going to actually show you how to enhance the blur in your image. And I'm going to do that because although I've taken this image in camera with a smaller aperture, which has allowed the blur to happen in camera, that doesn't always happen. And it doesn't always happen for me. I'm not always paying enough attention, and sometimes I shoot stuff and I might be at f8 and everything is in focus, but it's not really what I want the final image to look like. So I'm going to show you this trick, even though I don't think that my image needs it so much. It can be helpful to you in other images. So first thing we're going to do is actually merge these layers, but instead of flattening the image, I want to merge them so that they all merge together and create a new layer with all of these layers below it. So the way to do that is to go ahead and select the top layer, choose the bottom layer so they're all highlighted, and then hold down the Alt key and right click and then choose merge layers. And that didn't work. Excuse me, merge visible. By merging visible, I've gone ahead now and I've left my 3 prior layers that I had, but I've also created a new layer where everything is combined. And I'm doing that because the next step, I don't want it to affect only a part of the fixes or a part of the camera raw because of the mask. So I need to put them all together so that that everything is going to be equally impacted by the next adjustment. Now, there's 2 ways to go about adding blur, and I'm going to show you both of them just so that you know that they exist. The first one is if you go up to the filter layer up here at the top and you choose blur, there is a choice here called iris blur. This is a really cool filter that you're able to use to really be directional about how your blur works in an image. Basically, once it's here, you can go ahead and drag it. So basically all I've done is left click on it and I can drop it in the center. Now everything within these dots here, these 4 points, this one, this one, this one, and this one, everything within that is going to be clear. Now it works for me because it's staying clear while everything else, this is a transition area, and then everything else outside the circle is blurred. Now you don't see this as dramatically in my image because it was blurry to start with, but it's good to know that it exists. The other thing is this little circle with the white bar in it is actually the intensity of the blur. So as you can see, as I drag this up, it gets really blurry, and this gives you a little bit more perspective about how the barrier is to the blur, as well as the transition of the blur, and then everything happening outside the outer layer. So there's probably uses for it to be that blurry. I don't tend to ever go that deep. I just want it to have a natural feel like I did it in camera. So in this case, you know, where am I? About a 13 or 14, 11 in that range allows the outer areas to blur. The transition is subtle, and yet my center point of my image is still clear. So to keep this, to set it into place, we can either hit enter or hit OK. Now, it doesn't create a layer of its own. As you can see, it actually processes itself and leaves it on the layer. So that's one way. I'm going to show you one more. So to get rid of this, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to hit delete layer. I am going to create my merged layer one more time. So merge visible with the Alt key down. And now this time I'm going to approach it a little bit differently. And in some senses, this next technique is more complicated, but at the same time, it will allow you more flexibility depending on what image you want to use this on, because it's going to use layers and masks again. So again, we start off, we have layer 1, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to duplicate our layer. So again, Command or Control J, or right click to choose duplicate, or going up to layer and the top and choosing duplicate from the menu. Now, much like we did with the fixes, we're going to go ahead and turn off the first layer and then choose layer 1. And we're going to rename our layer 1 to blur. And you'll see how we're going to get that blurry in a minute. So now we've called this blur. So this is going to be our blur layer. As you can see, this is ultimately going to be our clear layer. So with the blur layer selected, you want to go up to filter, up here again, choose filter, choose blur, and choose Gaussian blur. We're going to go ahead and choose that. And you can see that now the whole image has gone to blurry. And you have to play with this. This is about completely up to what makes you happy. You can go really blurry, much like we just showed with the iris blur. You can go less and subtly blurry. But depending on what you're trying to achieve, I think actually where we started, probably around 10 or 12, works, maybe a little bit less. And we can go ahead and you see now that everything in the image, including our Columbine, is blurry. But that's okay. So we're going to hit OK. The goal is with that layer is to get whatever it is you wanted blurry to as blurry as you wanted it, because you're going to actually bring the flower back. In this case, we're going to bring the flower back. So now when we choose layer 1 again and we toggle that back on, you can't see the blur anymore. How do we get to that? Well, we're going to go ahead and we're going to slowly reveal it. So again, we're going to hit the add layer mask at the bottom. You're going to see a white layer mask. That white is revealing everything on layer 1 copy, but we want to hide part of layer 1 copy to reveal what's below it. So we're going to again make sure that we have our brush tool selected by hitting B or selecting brush up here, and we're going to toggle between black and white until we get to what we need. And in this case, because we have a white mask and we want to paint on it to reveal something from below, we need it to be black. We can either use the little two-headed arrows here or the X key to get to it. Now in this case, we're still going to go with 100% and we're just going to paint. Whoops, my bad. Okay, I do this to myself all the time. We want to reveal all the blur and then hide it from the Columbine. So my mistake. We're going to choose our mask and we're going to hit Control I, make it black. So my apologies. So all we're seeing now is blur, but what we want to do is reveal in the layer 1 copy the clean and non-blurry Columbine. So to do that, we're going to actually toggle to white, and the white is going to reveal what's on this layer. So now that we've gotten that straight, our opacity needs to be at 100, and we're just going to go ahead and paint it in. And I'll tell you, I work on a Wacom tablet. I can't rave about my Wacom tablet enough. It allows me to basically use a pen and draw as if I was, simply writing or coloring, and it makes doing fine work so much easier. I find that using the trackpad on a laptop or the mouse to be very frustrating for me. So if you haven't looked at the Wacom tablets before, you might consider it, because the more time you're going to spend processing images, it just makes life so much easier. And no, I'm not getting a kickback from that. I just happen to be a huge fan. So here I am. I'm almost done painting in my little guys here. And maybe I'll just add a little bit of whatever was here back. And that's it. So you can see that I've gone ahead and enhanced the blur. I don't like it down there. That's just going to have to stay blurry. I've enhanced the blur in my background while bringing back the flower and making that clean and as tight as it's going to be in this image. And if you overpaint something or over clear something, in your mask, all you do is hit the X key. That toggles you between the black and white here. And if you go over and you add something that you didn't want to, you just change colors and paint it back out. So it's a great trick. And I think we're good on our blur. So those two techniques for blur give you a lot of freedom, and they each have their application. So depending on what you're trying to do, you might find that the Irish blur is just faster, gets it done easier. But if you need to be more subtle and more detailed and go around lines, that you might prefer to do it through the double layers and the mask. Okay, so we're going to put the final touches. I'm pretty happy with the image and where I've gotten it. I've cleaned up the things that I didn't like in my image. I've enhanced the blur of my background while keeping my Columbine in focus as best I can. Now, actually, I'm going to show you one more trick because and I see this even in my own image, and it's not quite as sharp as I want it. So we're going to go ahead and actually sharpen the Columbine, and then we'll do our final step. So before we do that, we're going to do something similar to what we did before. We're going to select all the layers. We're going to hold down the Alt key, Alt or Option, and we're going to choose Merge Visible, and that's going to give us a clean layer. And I'm going to actually title that Sharpen. So how are we going to do this? Well, we're going to come up here, and actually we're going to do it the same way that we did it a second ago. So we're going to go ahead and sharpen, and then also duplicate that layer. And that's fine for it to say copy. And we're going to add a mask. We're going to make the mask black. We're going to turn off that one layer. Again, these are the exact same steps we just used for blur. And we're going to choose the sharpen layer. Now we're going to sharpen. So we're going to come up to filter again at the top here, and we're going to come down to sharpen, and we're going to say unsharp mask. Now the unsharp mask gives you this little preview. The preview also shows on the whole image as well, but you can kind of play with this, and you can see how it changes. If you look in the little window here, you can see how dramatically the changes can be. I mean, you can really get this up there, and if you look on the big picture, you totally see that that's changed at 500% as compared to 90%. So we're going to bring this up a bit. In fact, we're probably going to make it a little bit stronger than we might otherwise make it, because we can change how much is coming through with masks or opacity. And you can play with your radius. So I think here that really kind of looks cool and veiny at around 6, 6.5. Threshold just shows you how far it kind of moves out. I like it at a very little threshold so it stays nice and tight. Everything's nice and tight. And I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. Now, initially, we may think that this is just a little bit too sharp, but that's okay, because when we now turn on the sharpen copy layer, it's gone, because we actually aren't, excuse me, if it's white, it's not revealed. So what you can see is the white is revealing the sharpen copy, which doesn't actually have the sharpening done on it. But we're going to go ahead and paint in, just like we painted in the blur, we're going to paint in the sharpen. Now a trick is I could either sit here with black, because I'm revealing the unsharp version and I want to reveal the sharp. So I'm going to paint black to sort of hide what's revealing currently and allow what's coming from below to be seen. Or I can actually copy this mask where I've already done the effort to paint up here. And the way to do that is to hold the Alt key, left click on the mask, and just drag the mask up and drop it up there. Now, in this case, it's not going the right direction, right? Because what I had was a white mask and I wanted to paint the flower black, and what I copied was a black mask with the flower painted white, which in essence has now sharpened everything but the Columbine. So how do I change that? Well, we did it before. You actually just use Command or Control I and the two switch. So you can see, if I do that again, just watch the Columbine for a second. When I switch it, it actually got sharp. So that is a super easy trick to carry masks from one place to another, particularly if you've already gone to the effort to do the detail painting. Now, if we think that this is a little bit too sharp, that's okay. We can go back to our sharpen where the effect is actually done, and we can take the opacity and just drag it back a little bit. And if you can see, if I drag it all the way back, the Columbine gets blurry. If I bring it, say, back up around 80 or so, 75, 80, I get a little bit of sharpening in the Columbine. So that's that trick. Now, for me, my final step is always to check my levels, and so the next thing I'm going to do is go to the layer and add a layer adjustment. Go ahead and click this. You'll see levels right here. The levels come up. This is a properties menu. It shows you where your levels are. My histogram's actually not too bad, but I'm going to actually make a minor adjustment, and I tend to do this all the time because I like my images to be a little bit more contrasty. So I drug in my lights a little bit to lighten up the light areas, and I'm just going to drag back the mid-tones, which is right here in the center. I'm going to drag that from 1 to 0.9. And if I toggle this on and off, you can sort of see that it's enhanced it and enriched it a little bit. And that's it. So now that we're finished, I just want to remind you to save your work. And if the image, you have to kind of consider file size. I tend to flatten my images. If you look down here in the bottom left corner, we've gone from 79 or 80 megabytes to nearly a gigabyte of data. And that has to do with the fact that we've multiplied layers and merged layers and created new ones. The adjustments layers themselves are not actually the big things. It's when you actually replicate the image, which we've done a number of times, that's gotten us up to 600. So what I would suggest and how I approach my work is I flatten my work. And to do that, you can actually come up to layer and say flatten image. That'll actually reduce them all back to a background layer, and you can see down here in the bottom now that both the number from the original image was 79.9 and now the final image is 79.9. That is it's preference whether you want to flatten or not. I tend to flatten. It saves space on my terabytes, but also I look at it as if I was going to come in here and do this image again, I would start over. So I don't really need the layers once I've decided that I've achieved a final result. So that's just my method. And then I would go about saving this, and it would go back to Lightroom and go into my archives, where I can then export it to share with other people. So I hope that's been informational for you. I hope this helps you, and I look forward to seeing your work and hope you join me for another tutorial soon. Take care.